What is going on, all you Pokemon collecting maniacs out there? This is Ryan, the PikiPikaPapa, and saying that we look at a lot of data on this channel, that might be the understatement of 2024. We look at graphs and charts and data points, and we do so much research on this channel, and I get excited when we have opportunities to do videos like this because this is purely opinion-based. There's not a lot of fact on this. None of us know for sure what the best investment is going to be over the next 20 years. The reality is, if we did know, all of us would be piling into it, and then in 20 years it wouldn't be worth anything because all of us would be still holding it, right? You've got to find opportunity now that will have demand in the future, but not everybody is identifying. So those are the real challenges, of finding great investments. And again, I'm a long-term collector and investor. And the whole point of this video was because somebody asked me in the comments. They said, hey, listen, what are your top 3 investments right now? And I told you that I'm a long-term collector and investor for a reason, because I don't sell a lot of what I have in the short run. I am looking at a 20-year time horizon, okay? I'm in my early 40s, and I think 20 years from now, I'll be in my early 60s, and I can use this collection to do a couple of things, right? I could sell it to fund a special part of my retirement if I want. I could start figuring out how I could pass it on to my kids, which I would absolutely love to do, and maybe pass it on to my grandchildren. Like, that is the timeline for me, is 20 years. So when somebody asks me in the comments and they say, hey, listen, what are your top 3 investments? I don't think about right now. I think about over the next 20 years. And in order to understand what's the best investment over the next 20 years, at least in my opinion, and again, remember, this is all a guess. I have no idea what the best investment is going to be over the next 20 years. There is so much risk. There are so many things that can happen. 20 years is an incredibly long time horizon. But again, I always try and take the best information at hand, and so I can give the best information out at the present point in time, and that's what we're going to do. So in order to understand what the next 20 years might look like, I decided, why don't we take a look at what the last 20 years have looked like? And I started with understanding the production rate of Pokemon cards, because I think that's very, very important. Again, in order to find a great investment 20 years from now, you need to understand, okay, what is going to be somewhat rare 20 years from now, yet still be in high demand? What are people overlooking today that they could possibly have a high demand for 20 years from now? And that's no easy task, right? That's a hard thing to try and identify, but I started off with looking at the total number of cards that Pokemon Company International has printed, and they provide this information. You can find it on Poke Beach website. That's where I pulled this from, but it's really interesting to see how many cards they produce year over year. So if you look, I have the years on the left, and I have that total column. That total is the total number of Pokemon cards that have been produced all time. So if you look at the very bottom, 2004, 2010, 14 billion cards were produced over that time period, right? And then you look in 2014 to 2016, 21.5 billion cards had been produced over that time frame, right? So 7.5 billion more cards were produced from 2010 all the way to 2016, okay? So now we're starting to get these chunks of time where Pokemon is just sharing the information. It's not until 2017 where they start giving us actual year-over-year information. And this is when we can start, kind of making some learnings and taking some things away from it. And this is where we have an idea of exactly what's going on, at least from a production standpoint. So you can see in 2017, there were 25.7 billion Pokemon cards that had been produced up until 2017. Then in 2018, there was 27.2 billion cards, so an increase year over year of 1.5 billion. So in that year, they produced 1.5 billion cards, which was an increase of 6%. 6% increase in overall Pokemon cards year over year. Now, on the right-hand side, which is interesting as we start talking about 2018 to 2019, you can see the number of languages on the left and the number of different regions or areas that these cards are sold in. So Pokemon truly is an international hobby, which I think is incredibly important to the long-term investability of this. I think being international is huge. I think it gives the opportunity to really, really grow in the long run. And you can see they have added new languages over time. They have added new regions in which they sell those cards and products, which again, the more globalized this is, I think the safer it is. And I also think the better opportunity you have for future growth, because if people all over the world want it, again, you want a big audience to sell into. So then you look from 2018 to 2019, the total number of Pokemon cards that were produced went from 27.2 billion to 28.8 billion. Again, up 1.6 billion cards year over year, another 6% lift. Then in 2020, we see another 6% lift. Well, what happened in 2020 to 2021 to 2022? What did we have? We had the pandemic that was hit, right? And we saw Pokemon craze go absolutely insane, and people were flooding into the hobby, and the Pokemon Company did exactly what they should do to combat the scalper scalping, to combat all of these price gouging things, is they printed the heck out of it. So you'll see that the percentage of cards from an increase standpoint year over year went from plus 6%, plus 6%, plus 6% to plus 12% to plus 27%. And then in 2023, we actually saw it back off a little bit, okay? The number of cards that were produced was higher. They did 9.7 billion cards in 2023, but that was only a 22% lift versus the previous year. And then in 2024, okay, we saw 64.8 total billion cards had been produced for a year-over-year growth of 11.9 million. Again, another 22% growth. We saw additional languages and additional regions launched. But I like to see that it is consistent, because before the pandemic, they were consistently growing by 6% in terms of the number of cards that they were producing. And now we have 2 years in a row post-pandemic where they're growing at 22%. 22% is a huge number. I don't foresee them being able to retain that. But the fact of the matter is this: they are producing a ton of Pokemon cards every single year. Yes, the number of languages is increasing. Yes, the number of areas are increasing. But there are a ton of Pokemon cards out there. So we need to conceptualize and understand that as we start to think about what the next 20 years might look like. So then I thought, okay, we have all of these cards. Like, how do I try and break it down into bite-sized pieces to understand? Well, I said, let's look at some individual sets and let's go directly to PSA's website, because I thought this would be a really fun exercise to compare older sets to newer sets. So I have these set names, and these are just sets that I personally like. I think they're awesome sets. I think they have a lot of collector interest out there. And then to the right, I have the year. And that total column right there is the total number of cards from that set that have been sent to PSA for grading. The column to the right is how many out of that total number that were sent to PSA were awarded a PSA 10 gem mint. And then to the right is the total gem rate, right? Which is just a ratio of the number of PSA 10s versus the total number of cards that have been sent in. And there's some big takeaways when I look at this. First off, if you go all the way to the bottom, the OG of all OG sets, the 1999 base set. Now that does include base set 2, base set, shadowless, first edition. So you have a lot of different variants of that 1999 base set that are in there. But there's been 837,000 of those that have been sent to PSA to get graded, which is not a surprise. When they first launched Pokemon, they produced a ton of the cards. But the other cool thing is there was only 106,000 PSA 10, so that's a 13% gem rate. And again, I want to say this: base set 2, base set, shadowless, first edition, all of them are lumped into that. So when you think about the first edition and the shadowless variants, right, there's going to be a much smaller PSA 10 population versus the base set and the base set 2, simply from a production standpoint. So that's a big takeaway. And then you got Team Rocket, which came out into the 2000 year, right? And guess what? Less was produced. You can assume less was produced because less were sent to PSA, right? 287,000. Again, still a big set, still a ton of them that were sent out, still an unlimited and a first edition run of Team Rocket. But guess what? 287,000 total cards were sent to PSA. Again, 36,700 were given a PSA 10. So a small 13% gem rate. And you can go ahead and track the numbers all on the way up. And you'll see that in the middle eras, really from EX, Hidden Legends, all the way up until, let's say, Ancient Origins. Not a lot of cards have been sent through to PSA, and there's a couple different reasons for that. First off, back then, keeping cards in great condition, weren't a big thing. People played with the cards more than they tried to keep them from an investing and collecting standpoint. So, the card conditions weren't great. So why would you send trash cards through to PSA? Also, there were kind of like dark ages of Pokemon collecting where it wasn't all that popular. So the production probably wasn't as high. And then when you look at the gem rates were really low too. Again, for all of the reasons that I just said. But when we start getting into the Team Up, the Cosmic Eclipse, the Evolving Skies, we're starting to see a couple different things that change. Now, Team Up was a short printed set. So again, not a lot of them were sent through to PSA, but you do see the gem rate is much higher. It's a 47% gem rate. So we're starting to climb the gem rate ladder, right? Then you get to Cosmic Eclipse. Almost 90,000 Cosmic Eclipse cards have been sent to PSA for grading at a 44% gem rate. Then you start to get into Sword and Shield, Evolving Skies, the big set from from Sword and Shield, right? Almost 185,000 of those cards have been sent to PSA for grading with a 63% gem rate. That is an incredibly high. Out of all of the Evolving Skies cards that have been sent to PSA for grading, 63% have been given a Gem Mint 10 grade. Then you get into Fusion Strike, right? Almost 77,000 of those cards have been sent in, 57% gem rate. Lost Origin, 104,000. And then you get to Pokemon 151, and I thought that was an interesting one to call out because At first, I wasn't going to include any Scarlet and Violet sets because I thought it's too new, right? We're not going to have a big enough sample size. But then Pokemon 151, there's been 183,000 Pokemon 151 cards sent to PSA for grading. It is almost exactly the same as Evolving Skies. A much lower gem rate. We talked about the print quality in 151, but it's just interesting. So what you're seeing here is you're seeing that with these newer sets, a lot more are being sent to PSA. You see gem rates are a lot higher than they used to be. So there's going to be more cards, and then there's going to be more PSA 10s out there of the newer sets than the older sets. Again, nothing you don't already know, but I thought it was interesting just to look at these different sets over the ages and kind of compare all of these numbers. So with that out of the way, then I really started thinking to myself, I'm like, okay, so what over the next 20 years, like what is a great opportunity? What could be out there? So I started to ask a whole bunch of questions, and I came up with this kind of series of a talk track, if you will. And I said, okay, listen, so there's more Pokemon investors now than there's ever been before. I think we can all align on that, right? Like pre-pandemic, investing in Pokemon cards, it was a thing, but it certainly wasn't as prevalent as it is today. And I think that's a good thing and a bad thing, right? Like it's a good thing because we need people to invest in Pokemon. We want people to invest in it. It gives legitimacy to the hobby. It gives more people to buy the products that we want. It means people are out there willing to spend big money on Pokemon cards because they truly believe in the long-term prospects of it. But then a challenge of it is there's going to be more stuff available 20 years from now than if there weren't as many investors in the space right now. The next bullet point is, sealed investing is a newish trend, and when you think about it, there are a lot of people out there collecting booster boxes, a lot of people, right? And elite trainer boxes, and even one of my favorite products we'll talk about in a minute, Pokemon Center exclusive ETBs. There's a lot of people who are holding them. And when you think about what a lot of people are basing their future returns off of, or past returns, and we always try and say you have to take it with a grain of salt because people were not hoarding booster boxes and elite trainer boxes 5 or 6 years ago like they are today. So when you look at these Sun and Moon booster boxes and these Sun and Moon elite trainer boxes, and they have these wild growths, I mean, we're talking about 20, 30, 40% annualized growth rates, you're just not going to see that. It doesn't mean you're not going to have great growth. It doesn't mean that these aren't going to appreciate in value over time, but you really can't compare the current products to those old products because the supply is just so much higher than it ever has been before, right? And then rare is good, but demand is king. So I'm always trying to think of this balance, right? Like I want to find products that are rare enough so that there's going to be, a lot of value associated with it, but I also need the demand to be really high, and trying to project what that's going to be 20 years from now is very, very difficult. I think I got a little bit of an idea, but I am telling you right now, rare is good, but demand is king. Promise you, it's something you got to live by, right? And then the other thing that I think is actually a very good thing for all of us who are here and investing in Pokemon right now is that the Pokemon as a whole is an infant in the world of collecting. Like when you think about collectibles as an investment, what do you have? You have art, you have antiques, you have cars. Even if you think about sports cards, like the oldest card in my sports card collection is a 1911 T206 Ty Cobb card, right? Like that card's over 110 years old. I mean, even if you want to get some of the oldest Pokemon cards out there in Japanese, you got to go back to 1996. That's just not that long ago. So all of us who are here right now, we have these awesome opportunities to get some of the OGs, some of the original cards at what I consider some approachable price points where maybe 20 years from now it won't be, because hey, listen, a lot of us remember opening up some of these older packs, and as these new generations come in who don't remember having that experience, there's some type of mystique associated with it, right? And then the other thing I always say is great investments come from buying what others are overlooking. So you need to either find some awesome product that you somehow can understand and conceptualize that other people seem to be overlooking, or you have to find a great product that everybody likes, but it's just printed in short supply. And I think we're going to talk about two of those items here in a minute. But then I also got to call out, listen, let's be honest, there's outsized risk in investing in Pokemon. And that's why I always say it should be a small part of your overall investing portfolio. I share with this very transparently with you guys. I am very active in the stock market. Most of my funds are invested in the stock market or real estate, or me and my wife own a small business, right? Like we have a vending machine business. We aggressively are growing that. So Pokemon plays a big part in my investing space, but it's also not everything. Pokemon cards could go to zero and that would have no effect on our long-term retirement plan. That's why earlier when I said 20 years from now, do I want to use Pokemon cards to fund some special part of my retirement? Like it is not going to fund my retirement at all, but it could help us do special things that maybe we wouldn't be able to do if it wasn't for the growth of these Pokemon cards that I'm anticipating further down the road. So With all that out of the way, I'm going to share with you two things, and they're kind of lumped up together, of things that I think do have the opportunity 20 years from now to have some incredible gains. And before I even get into that, I do want to say sealed collecting as a whole is just, it's a safe bet, right? We talk about booster boxes. It's hard to bet against booster box investing, okay? Booster box investing, I mean, it is hard to argue against a ever deteriorating product in terms of supply, right? Like, people are always opening booster boxes, so the overall population is always dropping, right? Booster boxes to me is kind of like the steady eddy, like that's the market returns. I'm trying to say, is there anything out there that could possibly outperform booster boxes over 20 years? So big fan of booster boxes. I have a ton of them. It's a big part of my investing portfolio, but I also am looking for some other outsized returns. And these are some of the things I'm looking at. Now, I've shared this before, and I haven't really done a deep dive into the why, but as I alluded to a little while ago, Pokemon collecting and investing really is in its infancy, and I very, very rarely use the word vintage and Pokemon together. And I know you can go on Google and print up the exact definition of vintage, and I get it, but when I think of vintage, I think of things that are over 40 years old. That's what I think of when I consider vintage. When I think of vintage, I think of things that when I have them in my hands, I imagine the life cycle. I imagine what this must have gone through, how many different people must have touched it, how many different owners must this have had, and we're in a really awesome and I think exciting space, because a lot of these cards, which will be considered, at least in my mind, vintage in the future, right now I consider them original sets, they're at some pretty decent price points and some pretty high grades. Now, you think about it, in 20 years, these are going to be well over 40 years old, and I think that is really, really awesome. And the population for these cards, they might slightly increase. I don't think that, these are a hard stop in the overall population, but I do think that it is going to be a very slow increase, and I think the rate of demand is going to increase exponentially versus the rate of population. With that being said, one more time, I think that the demand for these cards is going to grow exponentially compared to the supply. So that is a very important thing to think about right now. And again, these are just special cards. The cards I have down below, and I have them all for a reason. When you look at these Jungle First Edition cards, like, these are the quote unquote, as far as I could tell from my research, like, these are the rookie cards of the evolutions, right? These are the first showings of Jolteon, Vaporeon, and Flareon right there. And I always want to get investment grade cards and PSA holders, and they don't always have to be PSA 10s. I think these Jungle First Edition Evolution cards and PSA 9s, they're not cheap, but they're all under $300, right? You got the Jolteon there at like $260, the Vaporeon right there at $265, then you got the Flareon right at $300, and I really want that first edition stamp. So I think that right now, these are some really interesting cards to look at. And then in Fossil First Edition, I know that's not Zapdos's first card, but I love that holo card, again, below the $300 price point. The Gengar is pretty expensive. A PSA 9 in Fossil First Edition is going to cost you just shy of $500. But guess what? Again, like, that's Gengar's rookie card. You know what I mean? The first English card of it. It's got the Fossil First Edition stamp on it. And then, of course, the base set First Edition stamped cards. I love the Pikachu. I love the Squirtle. I love the Charmander. All of them are below $200, and that base set is always going to be a very, very special, it's just going to be special, right? And as long as the Pokemon community continues to expand, as long as people continue to invest in it, I think all of these cards have a very awesome opportunity to grow in the future. And another reason why I really like them is because the market doesn't like them right now. You don't find a lot of people out there who really believe in the long-term prospects of these cards. I've even heard some people say stuff like vintage can't grow, which it just doesn't make a lot of sense to me. Now, I'm going to talk out of another side of my mouth now and say that I do have some bias towards vintage cards. A lot of my paper net worth I was able to gain from investing in sports cards 20 years ago when I felt like the vintage market was very undervalued. Not a lot of people were paying attention to it. I had these awesome players in high grade cards or high grade slabs, and they were just undervalued as far as I was concerned. And here we are 20 years later, and a lot of those cards have appreciated so incredibly much. It is absolutely out of control. So I think as an investor, I've been through this life cycle before, and I feel very similar now in Pokemon as I did 20 years ago when I was investing in vintage sports cards. So I'm just excited, but I do have to call out, I do have that kind of bias in my mind. So who knows? Maybe I'm just blinded. It's really hard to catch lightning in a bottle twice, but I do think, man, these cards are so fantastic. And if Pokemon collecting and investing continues to be a big thing 20, 30, 40 years down the line, I think a lot of people are going to be very invested in these. And then the final point of all of this is when we did go through that pandemic, a lot of the deepest pockets out there were buying the OG stuff, right? We saw the biggest price spikes come from the rarest, the oldest, the biggest name Pokemon. So the fact that the deep pocket investors, when we went through this really crazy event, which you hopefully pray to God it will never happen again, but when we did have this like cataclysmic event and everything went crazy, this is where a lot of people were pumping their money. At least a lot of the deep pocket people were pumping their money. So further down the line, if this becomes more mainstream and more people want to invest in it, I do think that the deep pockets will be looking at this, which is what I want if I'm an investor. And the final product right here, there's only two things. Like, this is very hard to project what are going to be the best investments over the next 20 years. And the next one is a very new product, and you've heard me talk about it a lot. And again, this could just be some unconscious bias of mine because I'm absolutely in love with this. But I do like Scarlet and Violet specialty set Pokemon Center exclusive Elite Trainer boxes. And listen, sealed is always going to be king. And I know I just talked about singles cards, but I do think that those OG cards have a unique opportunity just because of where they're positioned in the history of Pokemon. I don't just think they're great cards with big names. Like, I think they play a key piece in history, and that always helps grow price as well. But overall, I think sealed is going to be king. And when I think about these boxes in particular, you know, specialty sets, if you go back and look at specialty sets over the course of history with Pokemon, they have a very strong track record of returns. They just do. And the fact that they don't have booster boxes, that means these Pokemon Center exclusive Elite Trainer boxes and the booster bundles, right? Like, these are where you're going to find the most value. The other thing I love about these, and again, this could change, who knows, maybe the Pokemon Center will start printing a lot more of these, but at least for now, these sell out really quickly. Like, they sell out almost instantly, and so far we haven't seen them come back in stock. So when I'm trying to think of that balance of 20 years from now, like what's going to be in high demand, what's going to be relatively rare, I think these are going to check a couple of those boxes because you can't go out and buy Pokemon 151 booster boxes. They just don't exist. So if you want to get the most expensive, most high-end sealed product for Pokemon 151, you got to get the Pokemon Center exclusive Elite Trainer box. Same thing for Paldean Fates, right? Like, we've got the new Evolution set that's coming out, and it is absolutely selling like hotcakes on the Pokemon Center already. Like, it is crashing their website. I was just trying to buy some of them today. So I just think there's an awesome opportunity. This could change if production changes, if they start staying in stock for, you know, a year after the set comes out. Obviously, that will change, but I do think that this is a really unique perspective to go after. I think booster boxes and regular sets obviously are going to be the best investment, but then when I think about these specialty sets in particular, with the stamped promos, we've seen this huge demand for stamped promos recently. I think there's all kinds of upside and all kinds of excitement to be had around these. I mean, Paldean Fates, the Bubble Mew is going up, the Charizard's going up, and we're all going to be dependent on Pokemon continuing to drive interest in the hobby, continuing to produce fire cars, continuing to produce awesome content, which I think they will, but I do believe that these have an awesome opportunity. And again, when I talked about the globalization or the continuing globalization of Pokemon card collecting and investing, like, remember, the whole world doesn't even have access to these Pokemon centers. So not only do you have a very limited product coming out of a limited number of spaces, but the entire world isn't even have access to them. It's absolutely crazy. You can't buy these at local card shops or Target or Walmart or anything like that. I mean, heck, nowadays you can even order booster boxes on all of those big box retailer web pages. So I am super bullish on these, and I'm super bullish on those OG, especially first edition. It's got to be first edition stamped and in the highest PSA grade you can possibly afford. I think when I look back, when I started collecting vintage sports cards back then, I think that was a very smart decision that I made. I remember there were cards that I could have bought in a PSA 7 right now, or I could have saved another month or month and a half and went ahead and bought the PSA 8. And the higher the grade, the higher the appreciation over time, the lower the population, the higher the rarity, the higher the demand. I just think that's the official way to go. So this was an impossible video to do because nobody knows the answers. I feel really good in these products, but let me know what you think in the comments down below. Let me know what your favorite investment it would be in the Pokemon space for the next 20 years. I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you had fun. I'll talk to you soon, everybody. See you later, but bye.